Alright, so I wanted to talk about 7 different methods and techniques that I use to express light and different ways you can use light to make your art a lot more interesting. Now, I'm no master at lighting, but I do believe I know quite a bit about how it works, and I'd like to share that with you. And in this video, as always, I'm going to be using Clip Studio Paint. As to why I'm making this video, I believe that understanding light and how to apply it is a useful skill to add to your arsenal as an artist, because finding creative ways to employ lighting in your paintings can really take them to the next level. Now, before I begin, I need to briefly explain how light works. I won't go into too much detail about the physics of light, but I will provide a quick summary to give you some sort of basic understanding of how light works from an observational standpoint. So, the simplest way to think about how light works is when you shine light on an object, the light illuminates the planes facing the light source, and anything facing away from it remains in shadow. Now, there are many nuances to this that I'll touch on later, but for now, this is the core of what you need to know. And with that being said, let me share the 7 lighting tips and techniques I use in my art. I see a lot of artists paint light using the airbrush, and I personally don't recommend doing this in most scenarios. And instead of this, I recommend you use a harder edged brush to sort of sculpt light into forms. And what I mean by sculpting with light is using more hard edges to paint light boldly. I almost always avoid using an airbrush to paint any important light source, and the reason I avoid it is because trying to paint a strong light source, such as sunlight for example, using an airbrush will create a weak, artificial looking light. Now, of course, you can use an airbrush to paint soft light if that's your goal, but make sure you don't paint all of the light in your painting using an airbrush, or your painting will end up looking very hazy and unnatural. The only time I personally use an airbrush is when I want a soft, faint bounce light, or a gentle ambient light, or to show a glowing effect around a hard light, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this is not to say never use an airbrush. You can definitely use it whenever you please, but if you're going to use an airbrush, just remember that you should try to reserve it for soft lighting and effects, and try to balance the soft lighting with more confident, bold lighting where you can to maximize visual contrast. Try to remember that bold, confident lighting is more dynamic and attention-grabbing, and if you want to create that effect, you'll need a different brush for the job. As I mentioned in the introduction, knowing different ways to use light can be a useful skill to have. One way I use light is to create vibrancy in a painting. I usually use lighting as an opportunity to add extra color and brightness in areas I want to increase visual interest, or just to make the painting as a whole glow and feel more alive. And to do this, I always opt for using saturated, colorful light instead of white light. Now, this isn't a rule or anything, but one thing you want to try avoiding if you don't want bland or dull lighting is using plain white or desaturated light, because in most scenarios, using the color white for lighting will yield unnatural results. White has its place, but you have to be careful when and where you use white, or it will desaturate the colors underneath it, and this will do the opposite of creating vibrancy. So, if you want vibrancy, use bright, saturated colors that match your environment for your light. When you're painting light, you should always try to think of the geometry of the subject you're painting. And by that I mean, try to imagine your subject as a series of planes. If you break a complicated subject into simple shapes, then lighting becomes so much easier, because then all you would need to do next is paint light onto those planes that are facing the light source the most. Let's take a head, for example. It would be pretty difficult to imagine where the lighting should go on the head if you haven't studied it before, because there are a lot of complex details to keep in mind. So to make things easier, you would have to break this complex shape into simpler planes. One tool I recommend using to help with this is to use a model such as an Asaro head, for example. All you need to do is position the light where you want it and use it as reference. This helps you see more clearly the planes of the head. I'll link the one I'm using here in the description so you can try it yourself. But this way of thinking can be applied to more than just the head, and you don't always need a model like this. Just break up the complicated shape into simpler planes, and then lighting will become much more intuitive. In every environment, when there is a primary light source, this light usually bounces around the environment it's in and reflects itself onto anything else in that environment. This form of indirect light is called ambient light. One way to think about this is, for example, if you were to place a white cube in a blue room, the light reflected off of the blue walls would faintly tint the cube's shadows blue. And this concept here is exactly what I'm thinking about when I'm painting ambient light. If I want to incorporate my subject into the environment more effectively, I select the general color of the environment and light the subject with ambient light using this color as a sort of tint. This ambient lighting can either be really faint or very strong, but I always think adding it creates a more colorful and cohesive painting. One thing to know is that the general color of the environment will almost always determine the color of the shadows. And this is because ambient lighting is much weaker than light from a primary light source. So wherever the primary light cannot reach, ambient light fills in its place. These spots the primary or direct lighting cannot reach are usually areas in shadow. And this is why if we were to go back to the white cube example, if there were a white light shining on this cube in the blue room, the side facing the light most directly will remain white, while the sides of the cube facing away from the light will be bluish in color. One way I make the lighting in my art more compelling is to use more than one light source. What I usually do is add one or sometimes two more light sources at an opposing direction of the primary light source. So if my main light source shines on the right of my subject, for example, then I would place the secondary light source to the left. And I do this to balance the lighting in the painting and make it more interesting. The additional light sources can either be faint and the primary light source can be the brightest, or you can make all of your lights equally bright for a more dynamic image. It's all up to you, really. Now, as far as how I decide what color I want the second or third light sources to be, I'll explain that in a later point. In case you didn't know, Clip Studio Paint and other software alike have a selection of settings called layer blending modes. This is usually a drop-down list that can be found around your layers. And what they do is change how the material on the selected layer is affected by layers under it. And what this means for us is that we can play around with these blending modes to make light in our artwork look a lot more colorful and vibrant. And the important thing about using layer blending modes is that they cause the colors you paint with on that layer to blend with the colors beneath it in such a way that you can't achieve by painting the light on just a normal layer. On a screen I have the layer blending modes in Clip Studio Paint. They cause a layer to brighten the colors beneath it. You'll notice playing around with them that the different modes brighten and affect the saturation of colors with varying intensity. And it's really up to you to decide which mode you want to use for any given scenario, and I suggest trying each one to see what effect it creates. The way that I use blending modes is by making a new layer where you want to paint the light. Select a bright, saturated color, and flip through different blending modes and just begin painting the light. And I usually keep adjusting the mode until I like the result. I tend to use Add Glow and Glow Dodge more than others because I find them to be the most vibrant for the style I work in, but you should experiment with them all and see what works for you. This last tip goes along with tips 4 and 5. This is a little more intermediate and is totally not necessary, but it's definitely something I keep in mind a lot when deciding what colors I want to make the light in my paintings, if I want those colors to work together more harmoniously. What I do is use color theory to find relationships between different colors. Now, the idea behind this is that there are different types of pairings for colors, and these pairings have names such as complementary, triadic, tetradic, and etc. And I won't go into each of these, but I do encourage you to look into different types and experiment with using them in your art. I typically use complementary or split complementary color wheels as sort of a model when deciding on a color for my lighting. You can pick any color from a color wheel of any of these different types of combinations to provide you with a sort of suggestion on what color you want your light sources to be. Now, with this knowledge, you can do things such as make your primary and secondary light sources complementary to each other, or make the ambient light, background, and rim lighting on a character all have a triadic color relationship. It's really all up to you. This just gives you more possibilities to explore. And to show an example of me actually using this for lighting, someone asked me while watching me work on the painting I did for my last video why I decided to choose those two colors in particular for the light. And the answer is because in this example, cyan and magenta have a triadic color relationship. If you were to look at a color wheel for triadic color combinations, you'll see that cyan, yellow, and magenta are all part of this triad, and I just chose to leave out yellow for this painting. And you can definitely incorporate all three colors in a triad if you think that provides a good result. And this isn't really a rule to follow. You can really just randomly choose whatever colors you want, but if you're feeling stuck on what colors to choose and you want a more informed decision as to what color you should make your lighting, try using one of these charts. You can just Google search triadic or complementary color wheel, and over time you will sort of start to remember what colors are pairs, and you won't need to consult the wheel anymore. It'll just be there to help. The takeaway for this video is what I want you to lean towards doing is making bold decisions with lighting and colors, because you'll end up with a much more interesting painting than one paints it without lighting in mind at all. Always have a light source in your head and a direction you want it to shine. And don't be afraid to experiment or go overboard with absurd lighting scenarios. That way you can learn what works and what might not work, and you can always dial back if it's too much. Just remember to always keep the fundamentals of the physics of light in mind. And besides that, you can really do whatever you want. And with that being said, thanks for watching. This video took so long to make, but if you found it useful, I'd appreciate it if you'd, I don't know, maybe subscribe and I'll make more. I mean, you don't have to, but it'd be nice. And yeah, anyways, thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.